Welcome to Writer. I'm Peggy Bald, your host today, and with me is Dr. Sheila Tobias. Dr. Tobias has written several nonfiction books, soon to be 10 nonfiction books, which he's going to talk with us about today. Welcome, Dr. Tobias.
Nice to be here. Thank you, Peggy.
Tell us what began your interest in writing.
They say writers are born and not made, and in some sense I was a born writer in that I always liked to write. I liked to write descriptively about my life. I wrote a lot of long letters, even in the period when computers weren't available. But my writing of a book, of which I've now written almost 10, really began late in my career. And I think that's more common with nonfiction writers. If you are writing about something, if you are conveying information, you have to wait a certain amount of time until you have information and you have enough confidence in yourself that you can convey it. Fiction writers, poets in particular, start young. They start in their teens. They write more or less to themselves, as in a diary form. They write out of loneliness, out of emotional charge. And nonfiction writers are much more pragmatic. We have something to say, we put it together, we say it, we don't go through writer's block, we don't have to feel tremendous emotion, except the pure pleasure of writing. So I think the nonfiction writer is an altogether different animal from the fiction writer. And I have never written fiction.
You've never written fiction?
Not a word. No interest.
Well, you say the nonfiction writer is a different animal from the fiction writer. Can you tell us what you mean by that? How is your writing different from that of someone else?
Well, as I hinted, there's an information body of knowledge that is at the base of nonfiction writing. I have a certain amount of information I'm either gathering to convey to you or I have it already in my mind. So as an educator, it seems very natural that one leaves the classroom and goes back to the computer, today's computer, and continues to teach, explain, collect information, give examples, create a logical flow through the material, not so much to appeal to emotions, but to appeal to the logic and the intelligence. To me, it's an extension of teaching or an extension of journalism, but extremely different from the invention of a story, the creation of characters who never existed in the real world, or the putting together of words in an oral form that creates poetry.
Well, then how did you choose your subject matter?
The subject matter chooses you. I think most nonfiction writers will say that. I did not intend to write a book about mathematics. I was a history major, a political science major. But in the course of the 1970s, when my first book was brewing in my mind, I became interested in why women, more than men, avoid mathematics and math-based fields.
Why do they?
Well, that's that you have to read my book. In fact, they're discouraged by a culture that considers mathematics and math-like fields to be masculine, and they're discouraged by parents and teachers and boys of their age group who don't enjoy seeing women quick with numbers or analytical in that sense. There are other reasons related to the classroom atmosphere and how math is taught and all of that. But the book began to simmer, I think, in my mind as I interviewed young women at college and got from them very interesting and poignant stories about discovering a dislike for math or moving away from math or even liking math very much but feeling the pressure not to continue. From interviews with math teachers who thought these girls to be dumb, I argued they're not dumb, they're different. And out of this came a program, first a project in which I controlled the math learning experience of some number of young women. In college, I gave them counseling and math instruction of a certain type, watched them proceed through to regular math classes. And then I began to write short articles about it because people wrote in and were interested. The first article I wrote was for Ms. Magazine in 1976, and it was called Math Anxiety, Why is a Smart Girl Like You Counting on Your Fingers? You know, it was a clever sort of title. The book really emerged out of a sense that I had a lot to say, a lot to share, and I really wanted to influence people. I think that too motivates the nonfiction writer. I wanted to change people's minds about this issue. I wanted to change young women's minds, get them to go back into math, and above all, I wanted to change teachers' minds and cause them to rethink their prejudice about girls in math. So it's the passion and the urgency of the material that drives the nonfiction writer. The last thing I thought about was Book of the Month Club, which happened to pick up the book, or making royalties, or even becoming immortalized through an association with a title. One was just driven by the need to write.
So your need to write really arose from a personal observation you made that women in academia were being left out of the math and the science
It's the same thing that drives another person to create a march on Washington or an organization. It's that same kind of outward-driven urgency. And that's why I think the nonfiction writer, this is my opinion, has a much easier life. Because we are not displaying ourselves on that page. It's not my heart, my soul, my consciousness. It's just my information. I'm like a pipeline, a pipe between a body of information and you, the reader. And I don't experience writer block. And I don't experience self-consciousness. And I don't worry about how are people going to find my book? What if the reviews aren't good? It's not art. It's just plain work. And so we write very, very good books. I love reading nonfiction.
It's stimulated by a strong sense or a strong urgency or a passion, as you describe it. And that makes it a little different and a little the same.
Oh, it's a little different from plain work. It's a little more artistic, but it is not as, the writer of nonfiction isn't as vulnerable to criticism as the writer of fiction. The writer of fiction, when I criticize the writer of fiction, I'm criticizing not only that writer's skill, but that writer's product of the imagination, that writer's world. And here it's different. So I think it's an easier life, a more satisfying life for a person like me. And I don't think we experience writer's block. Fiction writers will often experience long periods of time when they are not able to function, not nonfiction writers.
So your observations led you to write the book.
The first book. And then I learned from that experience that I could demystify complex technical information as a writer. I could translate it into words. And so the next topic was military weapons and military strategic thought and military processes. And I wrote a book initially called What Kinds of Guns Are They Buying for Your Butter? And in paperback it was called The People's Guide to National Defense. And there I collected collaborators. Again, I don't feel this terrible sense of possession of my writing.
This book collaborated with
well,
you?
Experts in defense and in arms control and the politics of militarism. And I felt very comfortable working with a team. And I think that too is unique to a nonfiction book. I doubt there's much poetry, I'm sure there isn't, and very few short stories and probably no novels that have ever been written by more than one person. So why is that? That's because it's the individual who's on the page. In my case, 4 of us, I was the team leader. I had the last word, one might say, but still I was happy to share it. And I've since written other books in collaboration.
Okay, can you tell us some more about your research that led up to the books, particularly those on...
Well, I turned then to science. Once I had worked in the defense arena, I turned to science and found a subject matter, again, suggesting itself. If we were to employ non-science students and their surrogates, say some non-science faculty or graduate students in science classes, and ask them to keep a journal of what they observed, maybe we'd be able to get at an answer to the question, why is science difficult in college? And so I constructed this project, brought them in, had them keep a journal, and I wrote a book wrapping my interpretation around their journal entries. So again, it was somewhat collaborative. All these outsiders who'd been in these classes gave me material, and I wrote the material in my fashion. I call that book They're Not Dumb, They're Different, Stalking the Second Tier. And I've written 2 more books about science, what makes science difficult.
These sound like wonderful resources for both students and teachers.
They are meant to be resources, right? I don't expect to get any kind of Pulitzer Prize or a prize for, the best fiction, but they're very satisfying to put out on the market.
Well, I understand that right now you have a few books in progress, one of which is the policy, sexual politics, the legacy. Could you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, I was an active feminist during the 1970s. I started early, very early, given my age. I was on the cutting edge, knew people very well like Gloria Steinem and Betty Friedan and Kate Millett. All of them were my contemporaries, so to speak. And from that experience, took a lot of notes, never thinking really I'd write a book, but about 10 years ago began teaching a course at a college called Sexual Politics, the Legacy, which was an introduction to gender and politics for this generation of young people. And it was somewhat fortuitous that some older women, eager to find out more, asked permission to tape those lectures because they weren't sure they could come to every lecture. They might miss it because of illness. I gave them permission, and when it was all over, I asked them what they were going to do with the tapes, and they said, well, they'd tape over. And I said, let me buy them. So I had a set of tapes of my own lectures, which teachers rarely have. It's quite a treat. We would never do it ourselves. We're too embarrassed. And from those lectures have been able to construct about 6 chapters of what will be a 13-chapter book. So I've done additional research, and the book is nearly complete. I'm about to sign a contract. And it's an interpretive history of those decades in which feminism was forged in my lifetime. Some of the litigation and legislative victories, the backlash that came in the 80s with the election of Ronald Reagan and Phyllis Schlafly movement, and then how the movement survived the 80s, and some speculation as to where it's going in the 90s. But it's a political book. It's not so much about the arts that came out of women's growing consciousness. It's more about the political stage, what happened in Washington, what happened in state capitals, and how America's been transformed by those decades.
The number of women have risen considerably on college campuses.
As students?
As students, yes. What do you foresee?
As the future?
Yeah.
Well, it's because uniquely in the world, the United States offers college to people in midlife. I don't think our American citizens realize what a gift that is. Everywhere else in the world, there's a certain amount of higher education, but it's reserved for people who have made a determination to do higher education when they're young. And they graduate from a certain preparatory high school and they go to university. And if they miss that opportunity, they can never come back again. It's over. And people abroad are just in awe of our continuing education opportunities. And that's why there are more women, because many women miss it the first time around.
So do you think that in the United States we're in many ways unique politically, and politically perhaps as women, in that we allow access to education to continue regardless of a person's age?
And of their status. Married women, women with children, women who are divorced, women who are on welfare. I mean, we really have an open door policy. And that's why we have so many women in higher education compared to the rest of the world.
Do you think continuing education will be an important factor for women politically?
Sometimes, I suppose, a woman might develop the skills and the confidence, even in midlife, to run for office after going to college. We have one woman in the Congress who was on welfare, representative from California for some period of time during extreme circumstances of her family. I'm very grateful to have her in the Congress as welfare is debated. Who knows it better than a recipient? And I think we may find a more varied membership in our political office holders if we have more women coming through the community colleges and then running for office. I hope the community college gives them that kind of confidence. They certainly will learn speaking skills and writing skills and reading skills and analytic skills. No reason they can't.
Right, and certainly it's a great place for them to start.
Certainly.
As women start to enter politics, a lot has been written about the nurturing side of women, having to all of a sudden mesh forces with the competitive male,
the rough and ready
football players that are on Capitol Hill as well. Do you foresee that as being a problem in making political policy?
Well, let me give you a little theory about that. The sociologist Talcott Parsons and others had long ago agreed that leadership consists of really 2 kinds of qualities that seem on the surface to be contradictory. One of them is what they call the instrumental quality, which is to get a group to do something, to get together, stay on task, and get something accomplished. That's certainly, we'd agree, a version of leadership. But the other is to make sure that the group understands each other, that people are not getting lost in the shuffle, that everybody's needs are being met. And that nurturant function is something women do bring to the political process from their families. Now, the trick is, can one select the moment at which the instrumental skill is more appropriate from the nurturing skill? And the women I know, at least at the state level in Arizona where I live, and at the national level, are consummate experts in doing that. I refer you to Pat Schroeder, just as an example. She's been in Congress for about 20 years. She came in as a young woman and grew in Congress, and she has rapier-like humor, karate chop-like comments, one-liners that take out her opponents. She called Ronald Reagan the Teflon president, and that just stuck as nothing else
No
stuck.
pun intended.
No pun intended. But at the same time is enormously empathic to both women and men in her constituency and nationwide. She's the one who put through all the important legislation to protect divorced wives of servicemen from losing all their pension rights. She's the one who put through Parental Leave Act so that fathers could experience the early years of their children, adopted or natural children. So she seems to have the skill to play these instruments as appropriate. When she has to be tough and rough to get a point across, she's been on the Armed Services Committee, so she's controlled the Pentagon budget, which takes a lot of moxie. She does that very well, and when she needs to be empathic and nurturing, she does that. I think men are capable of doing that as well, but maybe in the culture of leadership in the past, there's been an emphasis on the macho qualities, the tough man qualities, and the women will balance that. I think every country is better off when women are part of the leadership. Every country, France, England, and the likes.
That certainly seems to be true. What about on the most basic level, from the family? We see children making a transition from family and sometimes very early nowadays to school. What about on the school level in the way that boys and girls are treated in the classroom? I know you've done a lot of your research and your writings have dealt with college level students. What do you see happening in the
elementary
lower level schools?
Well, it's odd. It's not a field of real expertise. I'm just as good as the material I've read, but it appears as if elementary school is kinder to girls than to boys. We call the process by which children are shaped for their adult roles a socialization process, just a fancy word for shaping them up for future roles. And in order to get males, little males, ready to become big males, that is, to be aggressive in the marketplace and to make a living and compete on the various battlefields, we tend to reward them for disobedient, mischievous behavior, for being aggressive as young children. We want our boys to be aggressive. Parents do not want their boys to be like sissies. Now, that aggressiveness that we're encouraging outside of school is punished inside of school. So boys are given a very difficult row to hoe. They have to be obedient and docile and girl-like in class to satisfy the teacher, but in order to satisfy their parents and the larger culture, they have to be aggressive outside. Girls, for that period of time, I think K through 6, have a little easier time because their socialization, if you'll accept the word, is more consistent. The behavior demanded of them in school is very much like the behavior demanded of them at home and out of school, to be obedient and docile and well behaved.
Well, it's saying to me that it makes it more complicated for the boys.
It is more complicated for the boys. That is definitely the truth. Now, things even out, and boys get an advantage when they get on in school, because the higher you go in school, as you know, as a college educator, and I know as a college educator, the more aggressiveness, originality, challenging the teacher, challenging the question, challenging the textbook is rewarded. So our docile girls who've learned to please the teacher and do the homework appropriately and take good notes and regurgitate what they've learned are penalized, I believe, as they get into the higher levels of learning.
How are they penalized?
Because they're not encouraged to be original and to be aggressive. In order to be a successful learner in college and beyond, you have to be very aggressive. You have to stick up for what you believe in and learn to marshal your arguments and challenge the teacher. That's how A students are made in college. But at the lower grades, A students come out of the docility. So I think in the long run, males benefit from having their assertiveness encouraged, and girls are punished for having their assertiveness discouraged in the long run. But in the immediate years of going to elementary school with teachers who value docility and obedience and being quiet, girls have a little advantage.
And you don't think that the teachers still value that in high school?
Not well. It depends on the circumstance. If a teacher has a very unruly crowd, she probably or he does value it. The other difference in the male-female orientation in school that is punishing for girls is the discouragement of math. That starts early. Girls are not expected to do that well. Girls actually do well in math, so long as it's arithmetic, one-step problems, doing long sums and subtraction, fractions. But starting in junior high, girls are allowed to fall off in the math area, and that causes a lot of hardship later, because most of today's high-tech jobs, even the ones which don't appear to be resting in science, but are technical, like being a television camera person and having to figure out f-stops and distances and light apertures. These things will require some degree of mathematical fluency. I don't call it mathematical genius, but what I call math mental health. That if I hand you as my employee a task that involves some mathematics that you don't know, you won't panic or quit. You'll go out and learn what you need when you need it. That's math mental health. Learning the math you need when you need it.
Even something as basic as balancing a checkbook or going grocery shopping requires
Well, that's too basic. I don't like those examples.
You think that's too
because
basic?
Because it's arithmetic. I'm talking about more relationships and ratios and more of the higher level mathematics used in payroll, in computer logic. What I would like to see is all young women willing to tackle those subjects, not necessarily succeeding at first try, but willing to tackle them. That will give them a better chance of moving ahead in the world of work.
And why aren't they willing?
Math anxiety, discouragement. A lot of young males find females who are mathematically quick or even mathematically interested to be unfeminine. I mean, a lot of this is cultural. And we know it's cultural because it's very rare in other countries of the world, in Eastern Europe or in Italy or in other countries, that females will be underrepresented in the sciences. It's
rare in other countries for
them to be underrepresented, and it's very common here. Our scientists will say they take a team over to an international conference, and there'll be one woman out of 4 or 1 out of 8 on the American team. The French team will be 1 out of 3, and the Italian team will be half female in the very same field, the same degree of higher mathematics required. Why is this?
Why is this in the most highly educated country?
Because it's also highly sex stratified, highly gendered, to use the language of feminism. It's a country in which very early on our little girls get a strong message as to what little girls are and what little boys are. And in our own history, the place that has produced more women scientists than any other place have been the women's colleges, which are fewer and fewer in number and are not going to come back. But typically, the young woman going to a women's college was made to feel very comfortable doing science, and the young woman going to a co-ed school was not made to feel as comfortable. But these are changing.
If you were to suggest or give advice to a young girl as a freshman in high school today, what would you tell her to take in math and science over the next 4 years?
Oh, definitely to take all the math she can get in college, in high school, to prepare herself for any field in college that she might find interesting. Secondly, as far as science is concerned, if she is willing, I certainly would encourage her to take chemistry very much, along with biology that's usually required. But the chemistry is a fundamental science for many other operations. One of America's most successful industrial sectors in today's world and tomorrow's is pharmaceuticals and chemicals. We export more of that than we import. It gives us a favorable balance of trade. The pharmaceutical companies will go up along with the medical professions, and to even enter as a marketing specialist or in PR, one is going to have enough basic chemistry to recognize the vocabulary.
Certainly.
And then if she has a little taste for that and enjoys it, of course, physics, which is more abstract, more mathematical, but very interesting and gives her the capacity to ask questions. I have a theory about education called the flypaper theory. And the theory is that the more stuff we have, the more stuff we learn, because things stick. And if you know a little bit of chemistry, high school level, and physics, you'll probably pick up some of the material that's just in the newspaper every day, on television, floating about, without much effort. It's a kind of sticking quality. We increase the sticking surface when we educate people. They think we're pouring facts into their heads. In fact, we're not. If we do our job well, we're increasing the stickiness of their minds, the surface.
Well, that's
my view.
That's a wonderful view, and we're about out of time. Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts with us today.
It's been nice being here. Nice being in Jacksonville, my very first time.
This has been Writer to Writer.